Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 5th of September. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, time to end government of, by and for bankers, and Abbott is a raving neocon hell-bent on pushing Australia into war. So first, Craig, time to end government of, by and for bankers. Now, we put out a statement yesterday, Craig, about updating people on the financial system inquiry, because as we speak, it's now a week since they made the submissions that were made to the inquiry public. And it turned out that there were over 6,300 submissions that were made to the financial system inquiry. You and Elisa talked about this last week. That's a huge jump up from the whatever it was, 280 that were made in the first round. Yeah. So they put them on they were supposed to put them on the website last Friday. They've put up most of the submissions on the website that were not about, they've put up no submissions about bail-in or Glass-Steagall. There's 700 of those they haven't posted and published. And apparently Choice Magazine ran a campaign on credit card surcharges. And of course, Choice Magazine has a lot of reach and gets a lot of publicity, and so they got thousands of submissions made on credit card surcharges, and none of those have gone up either.
It's really quite a scandal, Robbie, because we know from our own internal records that over 500 of those people wrote personal submissions to a government-run inquiry, and none of those submissions, or very few of those submissions, so far have been put up. What's going on here?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what I suspect. If you're in the FSI, which is as one of the people who made a submission, who's an ex-ANZ bank director, John Dalson, said this thing is being run by bankers, on behalf of bankers, for bankers. If you're those bankers in the FSI and the bankers in Joe Hockey's office, and we'll talk about one of them in a minute, who set this thing up, you see these submissions and you're thinking the barbarians are at the gate, right? The hordes are coming to sack this place. We've had the run of this castle for a long time. Look at that rage out there, because that's what it does reflect, real rage in the public, but proper rage, and it's focused on an actual solution. No to bail-in, yes to Glass-Steagall. Here's the simplest, most effective bank regulation in history, and they're determined not to use it.
Well, Robbie, just on that, I mean, when you say the simplest legislation, that's actually true. I mean, the original legislation was only about 30 pages in order to bring in the complete separation of the commercial banking system from the highly speculative banking system we've got today. And I've noticed in the debates in the UK Parliament, which I've been studying over the last week or so, that that's one of the biggest issues, is that this idea of ring fencing, right, which is being promoted here in Australia too, of separating the two activities of the bank but keeping the same board at the top, right, is so complex that it's becoming impossible to try and write the legislation to try and separate out the intentions internally of a bank. Now, the intention of a commercial bank should be to be very conservative, to be very regulated, and to protect depositors, right? How do you marry that up with the highly speculative, Rambo-like gambling mentality of the merchant investment banking sector? How do you do that legislatively? How do you separate the two? And this is what's been discussed, has been discussed in the UK Parliament a fair bit. And notables like Lord Lawson, the former Exchequer, the Councillor of the Exchequer, has come out and said, well, the Vickers Commission on ring fencing didn't even take into account these different cultures. And another Lord said, the trouble with bankers is they can get between the wall and the wallpaper to deal and get around these sorts of legislations.
Well, and Craig, the entrenched opposition to going back to Glass-Steagall in the US, because the US is where it was and places like Japan had it, the entrenched opposition to going back proves why they scrapped it and got it scrapped in the first place, because they couldn't, these predator bankers couldn't get at these deposits. And now they've got control of deposits and they can use them for their gambling at the risk of great risk to the public. They don't want to give that up.
It's
That's
very
the
profitable.
Bottom line.
It's very profitable for
exactly.
them, and this is not what banking should be. The banking should not be a profit at the expense of the economy or of the depositors.
So we want to highlight a case because we can now go public with it a little bit, Craig. It was made news this week that a gentleman who works for Joe Hockey, Tony Pearson, who was his chief economist for around 5 years. He's now left hockey's employment and he's gone to work somewhere else, where he's now a lobbyist for the banks. He is the Executive Director of Industry Policy for the Australian Bankers Association. And in the same move, the Australian Bankers Association poached an officer of ASIC, the bank regulator, the people who didn't police the Commonwealth Bank financial planners selling dodgy products to Commonwealth Bank customers that lost them all their savings. Those ASIC just looked the other way. One of those guys has now joined him to go work for the banks, the private banks, as a lobbyist.
Maybe they have to do this, Robbie, because of what we've done with the Glass-Steagall. Because, look, this is a shift. This is a shift from being sort of reactive, like the ABA has been, to being proactive on policy. Now, why would you have to become so proactive on policy with people that have been provenly in supportive of the idea of bail-in, the idea of getting the banks getting their hands on people's deposits? Well, it must be that this issue of bail-in is much more under attack with the ideas of Glass-Steagall in this country than we actually really
So you're speculating that they're marshalling their troops to resist this overwhelming public support for bail-in, not for bail-in, for Glass-Steagall.
Robbie, some people don't put submissions in. We had 700.
Yeah, that's right.
Whenever a member of Parliament gets a letter, they say, well, it could be 500 people that think that way in my electorate. We've published a full-page ad in the Australian newspaper last year saying no to bail-in. We've been constantly campaigning for 18 months, putting out this magazine, Glass-Steagall Now. That's gone everywhere. Nearly every second press release that goes out to 500,000 people, right, that is talking about this issue of bail-in. So people are becoming very aware of what bail-in is and what Glass-Steagall is. So it would not surprise me at all that the ABA is gone onto the front foot to say that if we don't push this thing harder, right, using our various channels that we have, then we risk that we might end up with Glass-Steagall in this country.
No, exactly. Well, let me just make a point about this particular gentleman, Tony Pearson, because now that he's gone to the private sector, we can talk about it. Back in March, Craig, myself and Gabriel Pewitt from the office here accompanied a special guest from Japan, Daisuke Kotagawa, the former Deputy Director of Japan's Ministry of Finance and Japan's representative of the IMF. He came to Australia to go to Parliament to talk to members of Parliament and the Australian government about what a threat bail-in was and the importance of Glass-Steagall. And this man has spent his whole career dealing with banking crises, which in the late 90s he was able to successfully clear up in Japan because he had no respect for derivatives gambling. He forced the banks to unwind their derivatives gambling, and Japan had Glass-Steagall in place so they could use that framework to force a solution that didn't end up in causing a global contagion that would have made it a global financial crisis back then. So he had a lot of experience. We met Tony Pearson and we got completely stonewalled. He had no interest in what this very distinguished gentleman said, and instead he chose the opportunity of that meeting to get very angry and very menacing at myself and Gabby from the CEC to blast us for having the cheek, which was the impression we got, of warning people that Australian banks were in danger because they were speculating in derivatives. He denied that derivatives were any threat whatsoever. His whole tone, Craig, acted as if the global financial crisis hadn't even happened, that a global derivatives meltdown hadn't happened in 2008. He was so intent on painting us as the bad guys for scaring people by talking about derivatives.
This is a nearly 23, $24 trillion aspect of the Australian banks that's off the balance sheets, Robbie.
So anyway, now what he's done, as far as I'm concerned, is he was already working for private banks before he joined hockey. Now he's gone back to the private banking sector, and frankly, it's all too common. There's too much banker influence in government policy. It's not just in Australia. And I wanted to make a comparison to the US quickly because I just finished reading an excellent book this week by Matt Taibbi of Rolling Stone magazine called The Divide, and explains the difference between white-collar banker criminals in America and why they never get prosecuted, and poor blacks and Hispanics who are always getting prosecuted for next to nothing. And he just mentions how it was back in the 1990s that a lawyer named Eric Holder, attorney, worked for the Justice Department, and he wrote a memo called Collateral Consequences. And he said in that memo that when the Justice Department prosecutes a bank, it has to take into account whether that will cause financial losses that might flow onto other banks, and therefore is it worth it? And by saying that, it means justice is no longer blind. So he wrote that memo in the 90s. In the 2000s, in the Bush years, he went to work for a Wall Street firm, law firm, whose clients were the biggest banks on Wall Street, Covington and Burling. Mm-hmm. And then in 2008, remember the election in 2008 that elected Barack Obama was November, the first week of November. The GFC was well underway. And Barack Obama got elected, and he showed, as far as I'm concerned, he showed his stripes from the beginning that he was always going to let the banks off the hook, because he picked that guy Holder to be his Attorney General, and Holder took with him as his second in command another Covington and Burling lawyer to be his second in command at the DOJ, and under them no banker has gone to jail in America for the biggest financial crime in history effectively, right? And this is people, this is par for the course now, and it's wrong, and it's just indicative of the, why people are enraged and are putting in hundreds of submissions to outfits like the FSI. Well, anyway, though, Craig, we were going to touch on something else, but we're running out of time. So we're going to have a break now. When we come back, we're going to talk about Tony Abbott and his push to get Australia into war. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Abbott is a raving neocon hell-bent on pushing Australia into war. Now, Craig, this is getting very serious. What's the bombardment that the Australian public is getting at the moment about all things to do with Ukraine? We'll put the Middle East aside.
This is 2014, Robbie, not 1914. But
someone wants to go back to 1914.
The parallels are so frighteningly similar that it is serious, very serious.
So the latest is, and this is, if anyone watches, I watch Parliament Question Time when I get a chance. Tony Abbott announced very sincerely and syrupy that, it's as if, excuse my analogy here, but imagine it's as if we're supposed to believe that the Smurfs, those lovely little Smurfs, are under assault by Gargamel, and so we are going into bat for the Smurfs, as you would, right? And in this case, sorry about the analogy, as I said, you're talking about Ukraine. Pure, good little Ukraine is under assault by big, bad Russia. There's bully Russia who's invaded Ukraine. And so we're going to do two things. We're setting up an embassy in Kiev, even though we're shutting down embassies all around the world, Craig, for money reasons, and we're sharing embassies with Great Britain very conveniently, in many cases. So we're going to set up an embassy in Kiev, and we're going to give assistance to the Ukrainian army. Now, this is what shocked me about this. Bill Shorten, up until now, who's a total US lapdog. This guy was exposed in the WikiLeaks leaks for going to the US embassy to give them background internal information on internal developments in the Labor Party when Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister. That's how much he was intent on sucking up to the Yanks, and he was promoting himself as a future Australian Prime Minister that they'd be comfortable with, right? That's who Bill Shorten is. Even the Labor Party under him, they've supported everything Abbott's done so far, including the embassy in Kiev. But when he announced assistance to the army in Ukraine, one of them, whoever the spokesman was, said, well, we haven't been consulted on this, we're not sure, it really is the other side of the world. Mm-hmm. And it really is. It's one thing to give vocal support, but what does Abbott think he's doing? Now, his actions, though, are in tandem with David Cameron's. And as we speak, right now, in the United Kingdom in Wales, there's a NATO Leaders Summit. So Cameron's there, Barack Obama's there, etc. And they have pulled out all the stops to push through changes to the way NATO operates at this summit that will allow them to more readily go to war with Russia. And this is what David Cameron is effectively demanding. And he's demanding it by using this analogy that Britain made a mistake under Neville Chamberlain in appeasing Hitler. And so today they should not appease Putin by allowing him to get away with what he's getting away with.
Standard propaganda, Robbie. They did the same with Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was working with
Hitler.
the West for many years. He was Hitler. Gaddafi was Hitler.
Yep.
This analogy is always reeled out as a massive propaganda tool. It actually does not bear any reality, because you have to remember, NATO doesn't actually have a reason to exist. No. It's existing.
Well, just explain that.
It's existing only as an attack dog for the British Empire.
But why doesn't it have a reason to exist now?
Because once the Berlin Wall fell down, NATO should have been dissolved, and there could have been another organisation formed out of that for the promotion of peace across the entire Eurasian land bridge, including with Russia.
NATO was a defensive pact against the Soviet Union. Yeah. So the curtain fell down. What was it exist for?
And it could exist only as a sort of like a combined, organisation for the promotion of peace on the entire Eurasian continent. But of course, that is not what the British Empire and the financial moguls wanted in promoting globalisation. What they wanted was an entity that could be used as an attack dog against a sovereign country like Russia.
Yep.
Because, as we've seen with Putin is not going to tolerate any attacks on the sovereignty of Russia.
Well, and also, Craig, that's a specific thing, an attack dog against Russia, but NATO is becoming a global army. And I heard an analogy which I think is really apt. It's becoming what the British East India Company's army was at the height of the East India Company. This global army of redcoats that could, dictate to the world. And so just listen to what the Brits are trying to achieve at NATO. They want to change Article 5 of NATO's charter. They've proposed to change Article 5. Now, Article 5 is the part of the charter that explains the circumstances under which NATO can militarily respond to something. And the way it generally works is under NATO, if any one country of NATO is attacked, it's an attack on all of NATO, and all of NATO will respond, right? So, but Article 5 defines an attack as an armed attack. And what the Brits are proposing to change it to is have it as an armed attack, but include unarmed attacks and ambiguous attacks as well can trigger a NATO military response. And an unarmed attack can be anything from cyber warfare, right, which of course they paint the Chinese and the Russians as the baddies of around the world, or something like what the Brits and Americans are doing all the time in Eastern Europe themselves, which are these colour revolutions where they fund political movements to run subversive campaigns against the government so they can eventually run coup d'etats, right? So they want to define that as an unarmed attack. So if Russia, say, does something like that, funds political opposition in the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, that can be defined as an unarmed attack, right? And of course, an ambiguous attack is just as bad. It's a terrorist attack. So a terrorist attack could be anywhere from some crazy fundamentalist or whatever. But if a bomb goes off in London or in Warsaw or whatever, that they can then pin back to Russia like they're trying to pin the MH17 on Russia, right? That can be the trigger as well. This is a very dangerous escalation that they're pushing in NATO. We better take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the people that are trying to balance the propaganda here. Welcome back to the CEC Report, where we're talking about this very dangerous escalation that's happening right now in Wales in the UK at the NATO Leaders Summit, so we can gear up for a full-blown war with Russia. And Craig, the other thing I wanted to say, to add to before the break, is we are there. Australia is present at this NATO Leaders Summit, and we have been made enhanced partners of NATO. Now, go and look at the globe of the world. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation. How far is Australia to? How close is Australia to the North Atlantic? You couldn't get further away. Where are we? We're in the South Pacific, and we are enhanced partners of NATO. That is shamelessly targeted at China. China knows this. China views Australia, unfortunately Japan, and the United States as the beginnings of an Asian NATO that will be targeted at them, the way NATO was targeted at Russia. Now, but we're not the only ones saying this. So I want to show you some headlines from the London Guardian this week, just a couple. You'll see this one: far from keeping the peace, NATO is a threat to it. And then David Cameron and the cynicism of comparing Putin to Hitler, which is what you mentioned before the break. This is something that we know, Craig, people, distinguished Australians like Malcolm Fraser have spoken out about. I want to quote now a very fascinating letter that a bunch of veterans in the United States of the CIA and intelligence agencies. Now, these are people who spent their whole career working in the US propaganda machine and dirty tricks operations, etc. They know it when they see it. And what unites them? Well, I think what unites them is they don't want a nuclear third world war, right? So they've written a letter to Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, before she got to this summit, where they're telling her, do not fall for the Iraq trap. And they make the point that, quote, 12 years ago, former Chancellor of Germany, Gerhard Schröder, mindful of the flimsiness of the evidence on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, refused to join in the attack on Iraq. In our view, they direct to Merkel, you should be appropriately suspicious of charges made by the US State Department and NATO officials alleging a Russian invasion of Ukraine. And of course, our leaders, Abbott and Bill Shorten, have been the most vocal demanding it's an invasion. In fact, they note, these intelligence guys point out that the current NATO Secretary General, Anders Fogh of War Rasmussen, he was Prime Minister of Denmark in 2003, and he declared at that time as Prime Minister, quote, Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. This is not something we just believe, we know. And they go on to say, and he has had a checkered record on such things ever since. So in his current incarnation as the Secretary General of NATO, he is the loudest person there thumping the table against Russia. They continue to say, suffice it to say that the images released by NATO on August 28 provide a very flimsy basis on which to charge Russia with invading Ukraine. Sadly, they bear a strong resemblance to the images shown by Colin Powell at the UN on February 5, 2003 that likewise proved nothing. Therefore, quote, if the photos that NATO and the US have released represent the best available proof of an invasion from Russia, our suspicions increase that a major effort is underway to fortify arguments for the NATO summit to approve actions that Russia is sure to regard as provocative, end quote, and we've just proven those efforts. And this was signed by William Binney, the former technical director of the World Geopolitical and Military Analysis at the National Security Agency. David McMichael, National Intelligence Council, Ray McGovern, former US Army Infantry Intelligence Officer and CIA Analyst. Elizabeth Murray, Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Middle East. Todd Pierce, Major US Army Judge Advocate General. Colin Rowley, Division Counsel and Special Agent of the FBI. And Ann Wright, Colonel US Army Foreign Services Officer, resigned. So Craig, that's the other side of it, which isn't getting in the media, but people have to understand that the fact that is the other side shows what our side is doing, and Abbott in particular is committing Australia to is very dangerous.
We've got reminiscences of 1914, where 60,000 of our finest died, Robbie. Here we are committing to be involved in wars that should never happen in the first place. And look at Julie Bishop running around the North Atlantic like the deputy sheriff of the British Empire, like the typical role is and has been down here for the foreign ministers.
Yep.
Deputy sheriff of the British Empire.
All right, well, that's it for this week's CEC Report. Remember to, if you haven't got a copy, call in and get one of the Australian Alert Service, which covers these events. But otherwise, thanks for tuning in, and tune in next week for more of the CEC Report.